Okay, I just want to take a few minutes and go over the areas that will be on our final exam so that you will have time to prepare. Since the final exam is a forced completion exam, meaning once you log in, you can't log out. And I'll go over that in just a minute. So I just want to make sure you understand what the questions are, where in your textbooks you might be able to start doing some research so that as you get ready to start the exam, you'll either know where to locate the subject matter or at least maybe have prepared a response that you can just cut and paste into the test itself. All right? So first of all, the final exam consists of 5 short essay questions, and it is a forced completion exam, as you see here. Therefore, you must complete the exam once you enter it, and you'll have a maximum of 2 hours to do so. The final exam is due by the end of the day, Friday, August 21st, 2015. So that's going to be on day 5. All right, so Friday, August 21st, 2015 is when the final exam is due. So please make a note of that. All right, so the first question is going to be describe the major types of taxes used to fund California's governmental operations, and approximately what percentage of the budget do each of these taxes represent? Now, you'll find our textbook, California Politics and Primer, will be the best source of information for this question. And more specifically, Chapter 8 is the area you want to start researching the response to this question. Now, one of the things I want to make sure you understand is, as you can see here, it says describe the major types of taxes. So don't just list them, describe them. What are they? What type of taxes? Who do they impact? That type of stuff. All right, so as you're thinking about this response and reading through the textbook or perusing Chapter 8, look for the types of taxes as well as some level of description. You may find that a specific tax might be the most common tax in California, so you might want to include that as part of your description of the major types of taxes that are used to fund California's governmental operations. All right, so again, use Chapter 8 in the California Primer textbook, and I think that'll be your best source of information for answering that question. All right. The second question has to do with the differences between AFDC and TANF. Right. So AFDC is Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and TANF or TANF is Temporary Assistance to Needy Families. So these are basically different types of entitlement programs. One, AFDC, began earlier, and TANF was developed under President Bill Clinton. And so you'll be able to see how the power shifted from how these programs were developed. So again, it's a little bit about federalism with this question, but mostly it's just making sure you understand how these two types of programs differ, okay? Your best source of information for this is check out Chapter 15 in governing states and localities. I think that would be your best source of information. And that chapter deals specifically with the issues that are pertinent, and so that's the chapter dealing with health and welfare, and so that's going to be the best source here of your information. So take a look at that chapter as you start reading and understanding the differences between those two entitlement programs. The next question is briefly explain what is meant by cap and trade. What is its status in Congress and in the states? So for this question, check Chapter 12 of our Governing States and Localities textbook, and that's going to be the best source of information for understanding cap and trade. California relies heavily on cap and trade. Part of Jerry Brown's bullet train is being funded by cap and trade monies. But you need to understand exactly what cap and trade is, and then you might better ask yourself whether or not you think that cap and trade monies is a good use to fund the bullet train. So you can take a look at that. The other half of that question is, what is its status in Congress and in the states? So use your textbook as a source for that information. What you'll find, I think, is that some states are moving ahead of the federal government and Congress in creating areas to try to reduce our greenhouse emissions. And so, again, pay close attention to that second half of the question. Some of the students in the past seem to forget the second part of that question. The fourth question has to do with write a history summary of Prop 13 and explain what impact it had on local government financing in general and education in particular. What are the pros and cons of this proposition? Do you think Prop 13 should be repealed? Is it even possible to repeal Prop 13? So a good source of your information for this question are going to be in chapters 2 and chapter 8 of California Politics, a primer. So you'll have to understand what Prop 13 is, and basically Prop 13 was a proposition that rolled back property taxes back in the 1970s. Prop 13 is often considered the third rail of politics, meaning you don't touch it. If you do, you're not going to get reelected. So understanding Prop 13 is going to be important because Prop 13 is often viewed as the big culprit when it comes to the downturn or the lack of monies that come into the state. And so Prop 13 reduced property taxes to a level no other state has. If you take time to look through your textbook, you'll find that in some states property taxes are relatively high. In California, they're relatively low. But other sources of state incomes in other states might be lower than California's. So, for example, sales tax or personal income tax or things such as that. So California is making up for lack of Prop 13 monies through other means, but Prop 13 was obviously used extensively to fund education in California. And so one of the assignments you have in the not too distant future has to do with funding of education in the United States, and in particular, where does California rate to other states? And often people go back to Prop 13 and say once Prop 13 kicked in, much of the funding to schools decreased. And so it affected our education, our teacher-student ratios, things such as that, okay? So the other part of this question that some students forget is what are the pros and cons of this proposition? So think about its pros and its cons. And do you think Prop 13 should be repealed? And is it even possible to repeal? It is one of those unique propositions that when passed requires a certain percentage of the voters to repeal it. It's a very high threshold. So make sure you understand that as you read through chapters 2 and chapter 8 in the California Politics and Primer textbook, so you understand what it's going to require to even repeal it, and whether or not you think that's even possible today, right? The last question has to do with gentrification. What are the advantages and disadvantages of it? And chapter 12 in governing states and localities would be a good source to gather that information. This topic of gentrification is really ongoing. There was a recent article on the news in which the city of Los Angeles is doing some gentrification in some parts of the city, and they interviewed some low-income residents who benefit from living in that particular area, and they believe that by the city of Los Angeles building a new high-rise with shops and condominiums and luxury apartments, that they're going to be squeezed out. In other words, they're no longer going to be able to afford to live there. And so the question becomes, where do they go? Most of these people liked living there because it was relatively close to where they had to work, or at least it was relatively close to a metro stop. So understand that gentrification is, it definitely has its pros and it has its cons. So I want you just to understand what it is and what are the advantages and disadvantages, because I think you're going to start seeing more and more gentrifications as cities begin to redefine themselves, and a lot of that is done through gentrification. Okay, so those are basically the 5 questions that you'll have to understand. Remember, it is a forced completion exam, so Make sure that you allow yourself time, that you're prepared, and hopefully by sharing the areas that you need to focus on, it will help you just a little bit and reduce some of the last stress that is often associated with leaking. All right, as always, if you have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to contact me. As we get towards the end of our time together in week 7 and week 8, oftentimes I tell the students, and I'll send out an announcement once we get closer, but that's the time if you have an issue or concern, you should text or call me. That way we can resolve your issue as quickly as possible. All right? So I hope that helps. Again, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to contact me. I'm here for you, so feel free to reach out. All right? Thank you so much.